Bitcoin is not decentralized. Don't get mad. Don't just switch this off. It's not an inflammatory statement. This is actually something that's grounded in fact. And I'm going to be really specific here. I don't mean Bitcoin is not decentralized in terms of distribution of coins. If you look at the rich lists, actually it's pretty good. Only 10,000 people. Just under 50% of all Bitcoin addresses hold less than 0.001 Bitcoin. And there are only 21,000 addresses in the world that hold the equivalent of 1 million USD worth of Bitcoin or more, which equates to less than 0.1% of all Bitcoin addresses. So the actual distribution of Bitcoins is really good, but that's not what I'm talking about. Node distribution is quite good. If you look at a map of global Bitcoin node distribution, actually, it's fairly evenly spread out. Yes, there is a fairly large concentration of nodes within Western Europe, and less so within the US. But generally, you can see that there are Bitcoin full nodes everywhere on the planet. And that's great. And let's not forget that proof of work mining is an open protocol. Anyone, anywhere with any machine can essentially set up a Bitcoin mining device. They just have to download the software and then plug away. So yeah, in that sense, the Bitcoin protocol is open source and decentralized and does, in theory, allow anyone to participate. But notice how I said, in theory, it allows anyone to participate. But in reality, if you want to participate in Bitcoin mining in a manner that's sustainable, i.e. profitable, or at the very minimum, no overall net cost to you, then you're going to need two things in place. The cost of electricity is going to need to be cheap enough for you to run a sustainable operation. And secondly, you're going to need to have the appropriate kind of hardware in order to mine Bitcoin in a manner that's competitive. Why is that? Because the amount of Bitcoin you earn from mining is proportional to the hash rate that you generate relative to the hash rate of the rest of the Bitcoin network. And the hash rate that you generate is proportional to the power of the hardware that you're using. In other words, if you have the most number of CPUs and GPUs available that are mining Bitcoin relative to everyone else, and if they're the most powerful CPUs and GPUs, and if they're all optimized towards the mining of Bitcoin, then you will generate the most hash rate, and therefore you will get the most returns in terms of Bitcoin being rewarded and mined. Now here's where the problem lies, because the cost of electricity around the world isn't uniform. You can go to one part of the world and the per unit cost of electricity may be completely different to another part of the world. And that creates the potential for inequality in Bitcoin mining. And that's actually reflected in real world events. So if you look at the maps of node distribution, they look fairly even. If you look at the maps of Bitcoin address to wealth distribution, looks pretty even. If, however, you look at the graphs of hash rate, i.e. the rate at which mining of Bitcoin occurs and the rate at which Bitcoin is generated, most of the global hash rate is centralized in one particular country. And that country is China. As of 2019, China was responsible for 75% of Bitcoin's global hash rate. Now yes, that has gone down by 10% this year for reasons I don't quite know. It's about 65%. But keep that in mind, there are 200 plus recognized nodes that are geolocated to China compared to the thousands of nodes distributed globally. Yet, as far as I can see, these 200 nodes are responsible for over 65% of Bitcoin's hash rate. And to me, that's worrying. And that's where this whole argument about being decentralized, or more appropriately, not decentralized, comes from. Because geopolitically, China is its own entity. Geographically, China is its own entity. Culturally, China is its own entity. And yet they have so much control right now over a network that is supposed to be completely decentralized. And it's not completely decentralized. This one very important aspect, the amount of hash rate, which is proportional to the amount of power and energy put into network validation, is localized to one area under a government that is internationally recognized to be authoritarian and is recognized to have had a fairly tumultuous history with Bitcoin. Now, I don't want to go into the geopolitics of China and Bitcoin. I think that's a really different discussion. What I do want to go into is the idea that we have 200 recognized nodes located to China that in theory are holding over 65% of hash rate from that network. And to me, that's a problem. Those nodes are located within a nation that has an authoritarian political regime, in a nation where a lot of the times you have to be close to a government official to be engaged in any kind of public project. So to me, if I was in a ruling party in China, I would be looking at this network and thinking, I potentially have the power to locate all of these nodes and then take over them and, in theory, conduct a 51% attack on the network. And that's the real problem here, is that, the hash rate within China is distributed amongst so many nodes, but if you kind of look into the details, a lot of these nodes, they still collate and collude to mining pools, and a lot of the mining pools still appear to be located in China. And that to me is problematic, because it's the idea that hash rate can be the result of a conglomeration through a voluntary agreement. Okay, right, I could set up my own individual mining network and mine for myself, but I could actually contribute my hash rate to a pool so that I basically get more frequent returns. But that's the problem. And to me, this is a problem because in China, as I understand it, if you want to get something done on a public or private level that is large scale and industrial in any way, then you need to have some form of collusion with government authorities. So to me, if you've got a number of Bitcoin mining networks operating within one nation that control over half of the hash rate for that network, then I cannot see how Bitcoin's global interests aren't influenced by the Chinese government in some way. They have to be. And to me, you've got a sudden loss of Bitcoin's core mission statement. You've got a big problem, one that the narrative in the press surrounding Bitcoin never really addresses. You see, the hype and the marketing would have you believe that Bitcoin is meant to be this open-ended, open access protocol, but it's subject to the same geopolitical, economic, social, and environmental forces that we all are. And it can't escape them by virtue of the fact that at its core, its mining protocol requires economic input. It requires the consumption of energy to generate, to validate, to produce Bitcoin. And because of that, because it doesn't have a cost-free basis to its production, it is subject to geopolitical and energy cost whims. That's an inescapable fact. It cannot decentralize from that. It cannot make itself independent of a political entity. And that's a shame, because right now we have a network that could at any time be subject to a 51% attack, but isn't. And I think that's purely because right now that network is worth so much that you wouldn't want people to lose faith in it through an act of collusion. Now, I'm not trying to be a conspiracy theorist. I'm not trying to gaslight. I'm not trying to manipulate. What I am trying to do is just point out a simple fact, which is that right now, Bitcoin as it is a trusted setup. And we are trusting that the Chinese government and the Chinese mining community is not going to collude to orchestrate some kind of reorg. So that's the problem, but what's the solution? Let's say we built eCommerce functionality directly into the Bitcoin blockchain, such that it was no longer just a ledger of transactions denoting the movement of Bitcoins between Bitcoin addresses, but additionally an index of listings for goods and services that are for sale, and an index of contracts between buyers and sellers for the sale of those goods. If you do that, you've got an e-commerce suite. And this is important for what comes next, because the other thing I would change is the accessibility to becoming a miner of Bitcoin. Because right now, the probability of you making some Bitcoin through mining is proportional to the power of the computing setup you use to mine it. And it is also proportional to the amount of electricity that you use relative to everyone else to mine Bitcoin. Now let's say we changed the manner in which Bitcoin was earned. So instead of mining it with rewards proportional to the power of your computing setup and the amount of electricity you consume relative to everyone else mining Bitcoin, let's say everyone could potentially earn some Bitcoin, but the probability of earning some Bitcoin was actually proportional to the number of Bitcoins that you actually held, and was in no way dependent on the power of your underlying computing setup to mine Bitcoin. Rather, anyone, anywhere, with any device capable of downloading and running the basic node software stood a chance of minting Bitcoin, and that chance was proportional to the amount of Bitcoin they held. Now, this is already in place, and it's called proof of stake, and this already applies to a number of other distributed ledgers already in existence. One such ledger that's already in place and incorporates e-commerce functionality using proof of stake is called Particle. And whilst the problems with proof of stake ledgers have already been discussed in depth elsewhere, one thing I will say is that the combination of e-commerce and proof of stake into your ledger solves a number of problems inherent to proof of stake, as well as proof of work. For one, the electricity cost of the network will not increase disproportionately or exponentially in relation to growing usage and liquidity on the network, which is exactly what you see with Bitcoin. But more importantly, and how this relates to what I said earlier about geographic decentralization, what happens with a network like Particle is that as more buyers and vendors join the network, more value is transferred to the network and more value is transacted on the network. But because the buyers and the sellers who actually use the native part token as a currency, because all of them can become stakers without incurring additional hardware costs, without incurring additional electric costs, then as the network grows both in liquidity and size, it can grow in geographic distribution without being dependent on the per unit cost of electricity. And this is important because that per unit cost of electricity, as I've said, varies from region to region. So when you can make the growth of a network and the validation of transactions of it independent of the per unit cost of electricity, you are now no longer subjecting that network to geopolitical influences that may dictate the per unit price of electricity in a given area. And in this way, you're encouraging the spread of the network independent of local geopolitical forces, which is great because as the network grows, more people will join it. Some to buy and sell goods online, and some to act as stakers, as validators of the network transactions. And in some cases, those people will be the same. There will be overlap, but none of those people will need to buy dedicated mining equipment, and none of those people are going to need to factor in the cost of electricity if they want to figure out how much part tokens they can earn through validating the network. But more importantly, as the network grows, the geographic distribution of validation is nearly guaranteed to grow with it. So decentralization from a geographical level is much more assured in this scenario. Why? Because in order to increase your probability of winning stakes, of accruing new part tokens through the act of staking, you have to hoard more part tokens. And in order to hoard more part tokens, you have to buy those part tokens. And if you're trying to buy a lot of them at once, you're going to raise the price of each part token, which means people who already hold it are going to be a little less likely to sell it to you. They might want to wait, or you might not be able to afford it. Well, they might sell it to you, but it's going to cost you a lot. So in that scenario, proof of stake as applied to the particle network protects against geographical centralization of network validation, because in order to actually do that, in order to achieve the equivalent of a 65% hash rate ownership for one geographic region, then those people are going to have to spend a lot of money in order to achieve it. And the thing is, as the network grows in value, they might be more inclined to start selling off and distributing the token more broadly, because it will net them a profit, because this is how liquidity-based systems grow. You have a small number of users at the start, and most of them hold a proportionately larger supply of the total in circulation in terms of the coins. But as the network grows and the demand for that native currency grows, then it will be spread, sold, and distributed more. And in that sense, Particle represents the future of the proof of stake algorithm. I think it represents the future of e-commerce. If you want a truly decentralized e-commerce system, then it's going to be a proof of stake system at its core. Because if you use a pure proof of work algorithm, I believe we will encounter this issue again, which is that if people are transacting large volumes of goods directly on a blockchain online, and that blockchain is proof of work like Bitcoin, then if 65% of global hashing power is now located within one geographic entity, then it's entirely possible that they may decide to alter the ledger of transactions to make certain contracts for the sales of goods and services go their way. And that's why I said Bitcoin isn't truly decentralized, because to be truly decentralized, you can't just be decentralized on one level, you have to be decentralized on every level. And this is why I look forward to solutions like Particle that are already delivering these products and services that I feel the world desperately needs and can benefit from now. And I believe that the smart revolution in blockchain is in decentralized e-commerce. deCommerce. The path towards a truly decentralized nation lies in deCommerce. That real independence and freedom lies in deCommerce.